John Miller arrived at the private marina in Manila dressed in a spotless white suit and designer sunglasses. He had come to inspect the island he had recently purchased, but his attention shifted when he noticed an old man in a simple barong and worn slippers sitting on a wooden bench. The old man was feeding stray dogs and chatting with local fishermen. John frowned, wondering why such a simple man was allowed in this exclusive area. What John didn't know was that the old man owned almost everything within sight, including the marina itself. John approached the man with a smirk. "Hey, old man, do you work here?" he asked mockingly. The man smiled kindly and replied, "You could say that, young man." John laughed, shaking his head at the man's modest clothes. "You should tell your boss to dress you better. This is a rich man's place, not a street corner." The old man simply nodded and continued feeding the dogs, his eyes calm and wise. Little did John know, he had just insulted one of the wealthiest men in Asia. Later that day, John was invited to a dinner hosted by a mysterious Filipino businessman named Don Mateo Cruz. John was thrilled. He had heard rumors that Don Mateo was richer than most American tech tycoons, but lived like a fisherman. "I'll show him what real class looks like," John told himself, adjusting his gold watch. He arrived in a stretch limousine, but when Don Mateo appeared at the door wearing the same old barong and slippers, John's jaw dropped. It was the same old man he had mocked at the marina. The dinner was held in a bamboo hall overlooking the ocean. The food was simple: grilled fish, rice, and fresh fruits, but the warmth of the people made the place glow. John, however, could not hide his disdain. He whispered to Elena, "This looks like a fisherman's feast, not a billionaire's dinner." Elena smiled politely and said, "Sir, this meal feeds hundreds every week. Don Mateo prefers to share what he has." John rolled his eyes. "That's not business, that's charity." After dinner, Don Mateo led John outside to a massive mango tree. "I planted this tree when I was your age," he said. "It gives fruit every year. I sell some, eat some, and give the rest away. That's wealth, when others can taste what your hands built." John scoffed. "I grow companies, not trees." Don Mateo smiled softly. "Then perhaps that is why you are rich, but not wealthy." John didn't understand, but those words stayed with him. The next morning, Don Mateo proposed a challenge. "Come with me tomorrow. Let me show you what true value looks like." John hesitated, but agreed. "Fine, but I'll bring my helicopter. I don't walk under the sun." Don Mateo chuckled. "Then you will miss what only feet can feel." The next day, John found himself following Don Mateo through rice fields and villages where people greeted Don Mateo with love and respect. No one cared about his slippers, they cared about his heart. They arrived in a small fishing village rebuilt after a typhoon. "Who funded this?" John asked. Don Mateo replied, "These people did, with a little help." Every home was built with sustainable bamboo and solar energy. The villagers gathered around, thanking Don Mateo for teaching them how to build, not just giving them money. John watched in silence, his arrogance slowly melting. For the first time, he saw wealth that wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives changed. A week later, news broke that John's biggest investment in the U.S. had collapsed. Millions lost. Reporters surrounded him, shareholders panicked. John felt his world crumble. He flew back to Manila, broken and lost. To his surprise, the first person to visit him was Don Mateo, still in his old slippers. "Now you understand, my friend," he said. "A man who builds his kingdom on greed will watch it sink in the rain." John's eyes filled with tears for the first time in years. That night, the two men sat under the stars. "When I was young," Don Mateo began, "I lost everything in a storm. but I rebuilt, not for myself, but for my people. When you give, you grow roots. When you take, you grow wings, and wings don't last in storms. John stared into the sky, realizing how empty his luxury had been. "Teach me," he whispered. Don Mateo nodded. "First, you must learn to serve." For months, John stayed in the Philippines, helping Don Mateo's foundation rebuild schools and feed the poor. He worked under the sun, wore simple clothes, and shared meals with farmers. The locals laughed kindly at his accent and pale skin, but he laughed with them. For the first time, John slept peacefully, not because of wealth, but because of purpose. One morning, Elena handed John a small mirror carved from bamboo. "Don Mateo asked me to give you this when you were ready," she said. On the back were the words, "A man's reflection is not in glass, but in the hearts he touches." John smiled. He finally understood that Don Mateo's simplicity wasn't poverty, it was freedom. When John returned to the U.S., his friends mocked him for dressing simply and selling off his luxury cars. "Have you gone native?" one joked. John simply smiled. "No, I've gone human." He used his remaining money to start a new company focused on sustainable homes for the poor. He called it Mango Tree Foundation in honor of Don Mateo's lesson. Years later, John returned to the Philippines to visit his mentor. Don Mateo was now older and weaker, but still smiling. "You've done well, John," he said. "You've planted many trees." John knelt beside him. "You were right, Don. Wealth isn't what you keep, it's what you give." Don Mateo held his hand and whispered, "Then you are richer than I ever was."